Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here this week at Re-Written Vintage Homestead. When I was thinking about this week's video, I could think of a hundred things that were all doom and gloom. And, I don't want to do that. I want to keep my viewers informed on current events, on homesteading, on cooking and recycling, just like my Facebook page says, rediscovering, recycling, remembering. That's what I want to bring to you, and I hope you've been enjoying it. But with so much bad news about the economy and policy making and things going on and crime, I thought we'd try something a little different. As I've told you before in several of my videos, I work full time, like a lot of you do. When I come home, that's when I do my homesteading work, and on weekends and days off, it's ongoing. It doesn't stop. But I think I found a way to connect with you guys when I'm at work. And so what I would like to do is this. I have about 5 favorite fiction books that have been a very important part of my life. And so what I thought I would do, I was thinking about my dad. First of all, he has failing eyesight and he can't read books. He was an avid reader just like I am. And because of his eyesight, he can't read like he used to. So he relies on my mom to read to him, which, by the end of the day, she's kind of pooped. So I wanted to share with him, some of my favorite books. So I thought I would do some oral book reading. What do they call those? Audiobooks. And so I wanted to start with one of my absolute favorites, and it's called The Dollmaker. It's by Harriet Arno. It was written around 1954. Now, the story takes place in Appalachia, in Kentucky, in the hills of Appalachia. Very, very poor people during World War II. And it's about the main character's name is Gertie Neville. She's a big woman, a big mountain woman, big and strong. And she's a homesteader. And so's her husband. So are their kids. So that's why I thought you would really enjoy this. But life takes them, the war takes them to a place that they're not used to and something different. So it's a great story about how much are you willing to change and sacrifice and what means the most to you. So since it's so relevant to what we do on a day-to-day basis, or you wouldn't be watching my channel, I really think you're going to enjoy it. So in between my other videos that I've been doing, I'm going to throw a chapter in every now and then so you guys can listen. I know I have several friends, including, and I do this myself when I'm at work. I'll put on my headphones and I'll listen to things, the radio or a book on tape or something while I work, just to keep my mind off things, and it really helps me concentrate. So I'm hoping that you might want to turn the lights down and close your eyes and listen and relax, or put your headphones in and work away, and it might help you with your concentration. But at least once a week, we'll have a time where we can learn about a great author and a great fiction book in American history and talk about it. So when we do these book videos, the readings will take place on my lunch hour. So typically I'll be dressed a little different than you see me here on the homestead. And I thought that was just a great way that I could continue to connect with you guys even during the workday. And also, so many of these books are relevant to my life experiences and to my family as I know them and remember them, to my family history and to current events. So throughout these books, I'm going to be throwing some little tidbits in that you might find interesting too. So come on and join me. Oh, I want to show you my shirt because this is how I feel when I'm at work. I wish I could text Marshall and tell him how much I love him and I miss him. And I know you guys are just like that with your pets too. We all share the same kind of feelings about our homestead pets, don't we? So it's been great talking to you guys. I hope you'll join me in chapter 1 for the Dollmaker. Let's listen. Doc's shoes on the rocks up the hill and his heavy breathing had shut out all sound, so that it seemed a long while she had heard nothing. And Amos lay too still, not clawing at the blanket as when they had started. They reached the ridge top where the road ran through scrub pine in the sand, and while the mule's shoes were soft on the thick needles, she bent her head low over the long bundle across the saddle horn, listening. Almost at once she straightened and kicked the already sweat-soaked mule hard in the flanks until it broke into an awkward gallop. "I know you're tired, but it ain't much further," she said in a low, tight voice. She rode on in silence, her big body hunched, protecting the little bundle. Now and then she glanced worriedly up at the sky, graying into the thick twilight of a rainy afternoon in October, but mostly her eyes, large like the rest of her, and the deep, unshining gray of rain-wet pine trunks were fixed straight ahead of the mule's ears, as if by much looking she might help the weary animal pull the road past her with her eyes. They reached the highway, stretching empty between the pines, silent with no cars or people, as if it were not a road at all, but some lost island of asphalt coming from no place, going nowhere. The mule stopped. Its ears flickered slowly back and forth, and he considered the road. She kicked him again, explaining, "It's a road for automobiles. We'll have to ride it to stop a car, and then you can get on back home." The mule tried to turn away from the strange black stuff, flung his head about, danced stiff-leggedly back into the familiar sanctuary of the soft ground and the pine trees. "No," the woman said, gripping his thin flanks with her long thighs. "No, you've got to get out in the middle of the road so we can stop a car going towards the doctor's. You've got to," she said. She kicked him again, turning him about. He tried one weary, half-hearted bucking jump, but the woman only settled herself in the saddle. Gripped with her thighs, her drawn-up knees, her heels, her voice was half pleading, half scolding. "Now, Doc, you ain't a-gonna buck me off, not even if you were fresh, you ain't gonna do it, so get on." Great, raw-boned mule argued with his ears, and he shook his head. He shook his bridle rein and sidestepped against a pine tree, but accepted soon the fact that the woman was still master, even on a strange road. He galloped again down the middle of the asphalt that followed a high and narrow ridge, and seemed at times like a road in the sky. The nothingness of fog filled valleys far below on either side. A car passed, and Doc trembled at the sound and sidestepped toward the edge, but the woman spoke gently and held him still. "It won't hurt you none. It's a car like the coal truck. We ain't a-stopping it. It's a-going the wrong way." The mule, in spite of all the woman's urgings, was slow in getting through his fright of the passing car. He fought continually to stay on the edge of the road, which was beginning to curve sharply and down, so that little of it could be seen in either direction. The woman's head was bent again, listening above the bundle, when the mule plunged wildly towards the pines. She jerked hard on the bridle so swiftly and so fiercely that he whirled about, reared and came down, and then took a hard, stiff-legged jump that landed him for an instant crosswise in the road. The roar of a car's coming grew louder. Terrified by the sound, the unfamiliar road, and the strangeness of the woman's ways, the mule fought back towards the pines. The woman gripped tight with her legs and pulled with her hand, so that they seemed to do some wild but well-rehearsed dance. Round and around and around they went in the road. The mule was rearing and flinging his head about, fighting to get it down so that he could buck. She eased her hold for an instant and jerked hard with all of her strength. He reared, but he stayed in the road. Yellow fog lights, pale in the gray mists, washed over them and shone on the red sandy clay on one of the woman's shoes, a man's shoe, with cleats holding together by leather tongs, pressed hard against the mule's lifted body, as if it pointed to a place in the bridle mended with a piece of rawhide. It seemed a long time or so that she sat, the mule on his hind legs, the car lights washing over her, the child unshaken in the crook of her arm, while she talked to the mule in the same low, urgent voice she used to get him onto the highway. "Don't be afeard, Doc. They'll stop. We'll make 'em stop. They won't take these downhill curves too fast. They'll have to stop, or we're all going to go over the bluff together." There was a loud, insistent honking, brakes squealing, and rubber squeaked while the fingers of light swept away from the woman and out into the fog above the valley. Then, as the car skidded, the lights crossed the woman again and went into the pines on the other side of the road, swept back as the car now, only a few feet behind her, but on the other side of the road, came out of its skid. The woman's voice was low, pressed down by some terrible urgency as she begged under the screaming of the horn. "Crosswise, crosswise, it'll get us by the other side." She jerked and kicked the mule until he, already crazed with fright, jumped almost directly in front of the car, trying to get it to swerve again, this time so sharply that it went completely off the road. It plowed partway into a thicket of little pines, and then it stopped on the narrow sandy shoulder above the bluff edge. The woman looked once at the car, then away and past the trembling mule's ears, and though she looked down, it was like searching the sky on a cloudy day. There was only fog, thickened in splotches, greenish above the pasture field, brownish over the corn far down in the valley below, the treetops by the bluff edge. "You done real good, you done real good," she whispered to the mule. Then, all in one swift motion, she swung her leg over the mule's back, looped the bridle over the saddle horn, turned the dazed mule southward, and slapped him on the shoulder. "Get," she said. She did not look after him as he leapt away, broken ribbons of foam flying down his chin and blood oozing from a cut on his left hind leg where the car had grazed him. She hurried the few steps along the bluff edge to the car as if afraid it would take off again. But her hand was reaching for the front door handle before the door opened slowly, cautiously, and a soldier, his head almost to her chin, got out. He stared up at her and did not answer when she begged all in one breath, "I've got to have a lift. My little boy, he's..." The soldier was no longer looking at her. His eyes, blue and with unremembering look of a very old man's, were fixed on the poplar tops rising above the bluff edge. He looked past them and down in the valley. Slowly taking his glance away, he reached for the handle of the back door, but dropped his hands when he saw that the window was starting to open. The woman turned to the drop-down window and watched impatiently, while first a hard and shiny soldier's cap rose above it. Then a man's face, straight and neat and hard, appearing above the cap, but flushed now with surprise and anger. with a flat, careful pronunciation of the words, "You realize you almost ran me off the road. If you can't manage a horse, don't ride one on the highway. Don't you know there's a war and this road carries..." The woman had listened intently, watching the man's lips, her brows drawn somewhat together like someone listening to a language that she only partially understood. "I know there is a war," she said, reaching for the door handle. "That's why the doctor closest home is gone. It was a mule," she went on. "I managed him. I had to make him stop. I've got to get my little boy to the doctor quick." She had one foot inside the door, the child held now in her two hands as she prepared to lay him on the seat. The man, plainly irritated because he had neglected to hold the door shut, continued to sit by it, his legs outspread, barring her way. His hand moved slowly as he wanted her to see it touch a pistol that he had polished in a holster by his side. He let the pistol speak to her more than his toneless, unruffled words when he said, "You must use other means of getting your child to the doctor." He reached swiftly and jerked the door so that she, bent as she was, and with that heavy bundle in her two hands, staggered back. Her head flopped downward to his knees, but she righted herself and kept one foot in the door. "If my business were not so urgent," he said, now taking his hand from the door, "I would have you arrested for sabotage. I travel from," he hesitated, "an important place on urgent business." The voice still was not a man's voice, but the shiny cap, the bright leather, and the pistol. It sharpened a little when he said, turning from her to the driver, "Now get back in the car and drive on." He looked once at the bundle where one small, sunburned, blue-nailed little hand waved aimlessly out of the blanket folds. And then, letting the door swing wide, he jerked it swiftly so that it struck hard against the woman's back, bent again as she searched in his eyes. She straightened and put the little hand back under the blanket, but continued to stand between the door and the car. "I'm sorry you're the Army. Probably from Oak Ridge, I reckon, but I'd stopped you anyhow." Her voice was quiet as the voice below the cap. "You can shoot me now and give me and this young'un a lift to the closest doctor." And even in the man's work shoes, the long and shapeless coat, green tinged with age, open, giving glimpses of a blue apron faded in strange squares, as if it might at one time been something else, a man's denim trousers or something, or an overall jumper. She held herself proudly, saying, "You want my name? I'm Gertie Nevels from Ballou, Kentucky. Now let me lay my little boy down. You can't go." The officer had flung the door and suddenly outward again. Still she did not fall when it banged back against her, though in her attempts to keep from falling forward into the car and onto the child, she dropped to her knees, her feet sliding through the gravel of the bluff edge. The officer gripped the pistol butt, and his voice shrilled a little as he said to the young soldier who had stood stiff silent, staring at the woman, "Get in and drive. She'll have to drop off then." The other took his eyes from the blanket, which was very still now. He saluted and said, "Yes, sir," but continued to stand, his body pressed against the car, his glance going to the treetops below his feet. "Back up the road and drive on," the other repeated, his face reddening, his eyes determinedly fixed straight in front of him. "Yes, sir," the other said again, unmoving. There was in his questioning acceptance of the command some slight little note of pleasure. He looked up at the tall woman as if he would share it with her. Their glances crossed, but the trouble and the urgency of her need would not let anything else come into her eyes. She looked again at the door. "You want him to go over the bluff?" and her voice was weary, almost breaking, like an overwrought mother speaking to a stubborn child. The older man, for the first time, looked past the woman and realized that what he had taken for a continuation of the brush and scrub pine was the tops of tall growing trees below a bluff. He looked quickly away and began a rapid edging along the seat to the opposite door. It was only when he was out of the car and a few feet from the bluff edge that he was able to speak with a voice of polished leather and pistol handle and command the other to back out. The woman, as soon as the officer moved, had laid the child on the seat and then stood a moment by the door watching the driver, shaking her head slowly, frowning as he raced the motor until the car shivered and the smoking rear wheels dug holes in the sandy shoulder. "That'll do no good," she said. And then more loudly, her voice lifted above the roaring motor. "Have you got an axe?" He shook his head, smiling a little, and then his eyes were blank, prim like his mouth, when the other told him to turn off the motor. The woman picked up a large sand rock and dropped it behind one of the deeply sunken rear wheels. "Have you got a jack?" she asked the officer. "You could heist it up with the jack and get rocks under them wheels and then back out of the road." "Take your child out of this car and get on," he said, his voice no longer smooth. "We may be stuck here until I can get a tow truck and you'll be arrested." She glanced at him briefly and smoothed back her straight, dark brown hair with a bended arm, and then drawing the bottom of her apron into one hand to form a kind of sack, she began running around, gathering rocks with the other hand, going in a quick, squatting run, never straightening in her haste, never looking up. The young soldier had by now gotten out of the car and stood by it, his back and shoulders very straight, his hands dropped by his side so that a band of colored ribbon was bright on his dull uniform. The woman glanced curiously at it as she dumped a load of rocks by the wheel. The officer looked at him and his voice was shrill, again to an angry woman. Again, akin to an angry woman's. "Hatcher, you're not on the parade ground." "Yes, sir," the other said, drawing himself up still more rigidly. "Get out the jack," the officer said, after frowning a moment at the woman, as if to loathe to repeat her suggestion. "Yes, hurry, please," the woman said, not pausing in getting her rocks, but looking toward the child on the back seat. It had struggled until the blanket had fallen away from its head, showing dark hair above a face that through the windows shone yellowish white, contorted with some terrible effort to cry or to scream. Like the woman as she was, squatting through the mud, the struggling child seemed almost animal-like and unhuman compared to the two neatly dressed men. The woman hurried up again with another apronful of rocks and dumped them and went on darting, stooping, running along the bluff edge, searching for more. The young soldier, in an awkward, fumbling way of a man, neither liking nor knowing his business, got out the jack and set it in the sandy mud under the rear bumper. "That's no good," the woman said, coming up with more rocks, and with one hand still holding the apron, she picked up the jack, put a flat rock where it had been, reset it, gave it a critical glance. "That'll hold now," she said. She dumped her rocks by the wheel, but continued to squat, studying now the pines caught under the front of the car. The officer stood at the edge of the asphalt, silent. Sometimes he looked up and down the road, and often he glanced at his wristwatch, but mostly his frowning glance was fixed on the car. He watched the woman now. Her hands had been bruised with rocks and apron when she had bent by the wheel. Now one hand was still holding her emptied apron as she straightened, but in the other was a long knife, bright, thin, and sharply pointed. The man watching took a step backward while his hand went again to the pistol butt. The woman, without looking at either man, knelt by the front of the car and, reaching far under the car with a knife, slashed rapidly at the entangled pine saplings, while the other hand she jerked them free and flung them behind her. Finished with the pines, she went quickly along the bluff edge by the car, her glance searching through the window toward the child, still now, with the hand of one down, hanging arm, bruising and brushing the floor. She watched only an instant and did not bend to listen, for clearly in the silence came the child's short, choking gasps. She hurried on around the back of the car and bent above the soldier, only now getting the jack into working position. "Hurry," she begged him in the same urgent voice she had used on the mule. "Please, can't you hurry? He's a-choking us so." And in her haste to get a wheel on solid rock, she began clawing at the muddy earth with her hands, pushing rocks under the tire as it slowly lifted. In a moment, the officer called, "That's enough, try backing out now." Some of the woman's need for haste seemed to have entered into the soldier. He straightened and glanced quickly toward the child, struggling with its head dangling over the edge of the seat, its eyes rolled back, but unseeing. He turned quickly and hurried into the driver's seat without taking time to salute or say, "Yes, sir." The woman ran to the back wheel that had dug such a rut in the mud and watched anxiously while the driver started the motor, raced it as he backed an inch or so. The car stopped, the motor roaring, the wheels spinning, smoking and flinging mud, rocks, and pine brush into the woman's face, bent close above them in her frantic efforts with hands and feet to keep the brush and rocks under the wheel. "Try rocking out now," the officer said. "Pull up and then shift, quick into reverse." The soldier was silent, looking at the emptiness in front of him. With the bent young pines cut away, the bumper seemed to hang above the alley. He moved at last a few inches forward, but slowly, while the woman pushed rocks behind the rear wheels, jumping first from one to the other as she tried to force the rocks into the earth with her heavy shoes. The car stopped. The driver shifted again into reverse, and the woman stood waiting between the side of the car and the bluff, her long arms a little lifted, the big jointed fingers of her great hands spread wide, her eyes on the black fender, her shoulders hunched like those of an animal gathering itself for a spring. The motor roared again, and the back wheels bit an inch or so into the rocks and mud and then spun. The woman plunged, flinging her two hard palms against the fender, her body arched with the push like a too tightly strung bow. Her eyes bulged, the muscles in her neck and face writhed under the thin brown skin. Her big shoes dug holes in the mud in their efforts to keep still against the power of the pushing hands. The car hung trembling, shivering, and one of the women's feet began to slide toward the bluff edge. Then her body seemed to lengthen, for the car moved. The woman's hands stayed with the fender until it pulled away from them. She fell sideways by the bluff edge so that the front wheel scraped her hip, and the bumper touched strands of the dark hair tumbled from the thick knob worn high on her head. She stayed a moment in the mud, her knees doubled under her, her hands dropped flat on the earth, her drooping head between her arms, her whole body gasping for breath. She lifted her head, shook it as if to clear some dimness from her eyes, smoothed back her hair, then got slowly to her feet, still gasping and staggering a little. She hurried to the car, stopped again, but ready to start with its wheels on the hard-packed gravel by the road. She jerked the door open and started in, but with the awkwardness of one unused to cars, she bumped her head against the door frame. She was just getting her wide shoulders through, her eyes on the child's face, when the officer, much smaller and more accustomed to cars than she, opened the door on his side, stepped partway in, and tried to pick up the child. It seemed heavier than he had thought. and instead of lifting it, he jerked it quickly, a hand on either shoulder, across the seat, through the door, keeping it always at arm's length, as if it had been some vile and dirty animal. The woman snatched the child, but caught only the blanket. She tried to jump into the car, but her long, loose coattail got caught under her feet, and she squatted for an instant, unable to rise, trapped by her coattail. Her long, mud-streaked hair had fallen over her face, and though her eyes were big and unbelieving, as the man said, straightening from pulling the child into the road a few feet from the car, "You've helped undo a little of the damage you've done. But," he drew a quick breath, "I've no time for giving rides. I'm part of the army, traveling on important business. If you must go with me, you'll leave your child in the road. He isn't so sick." He went on, putting his foot through the door, even though the woman, still crouching, struggled through the other door. He seemed quite active, kicking around, actually. And then to the driver, with no sound of shrillness, he said, "Go on." The woman gave the driver a swift, measuring glance, saw his stiff shoulders and his face turned straight ahead, as if he were part of the car to be stopped or started at the will of the other. The car moved slowly. The officer was in now, one hand on the back of the front seat, the other closing the door. She gave an awkward squatting lunge across the car, her hands flung palm outward, as when she had flung herself against the fender. One hand caught the small man's wrist above his pistol, and the other caught his shoulder, high up, close to his neck, pushing, grasping more than striking, for she was still entangled in her coat. He half sat and half fell in the road, one foot across the child. She did not look at him, but reached from the doorway of the car for the child. Her voice came a low, breathless crying. "Can you not see that my child's choking to death?" she said. "I've got to get him to the doctor." One of the child's hands moved aimlessly, weakly knocking the blanket from his face. She gave a cry, her voice shrill, breaking as if all the tightness and calmness that had carried her through this ride on the mule and the stopping and starting of the car were worn away. "Amos, Amos, it's Mommy, honey, Amos," she was saying now, while the child's head dangled over her arm. His unseeing eyes were rolled far back. The whites bulged out of his dark, purplish face, while mucus and saliva dribbled from his blue-lipped, swollen mouth. She ran her finger down his throat, bringing up yellow-tinged mucus and ill-smelling vomit. He gave a short, whispering breath that seemed to go no deeper than his choked-up throat. She blew in his mouth and shook him, turned him over, repeating the question, "Amos, Amos, oh, Amos." The driver, who had leaped from his seat when she pushed the other through the car, was still staring at the child, his hands under the older man's elbows, though the latter was already up and straightening his cap. For the first time, he actually looked at the child. "Shake him by his heels and slap him on the back," the younger soldier said. "Yes, take him by the heels," the officer had repeated. "Whatever is choking him might come loose." And now he seemed more than soldier, at once troubled and repelled by the sick child. The woman was looking about her, shaking the child cradled in her arms with quick, jerky motions. "It's a disease," she said. "There's no shaking it out." She saw what had apparently been hunting. She saw what she had apparently been hunting. A few feet up the road was a smooth, wide shelf of sandstone, like a little porch hung over the valley. She ran up there and laid the child on the stone, begging of the men, "Help me, help me, help me." Meanwhile, unbuttoning the little boy's blue cotton jumper and under it his shirt, straightening him on the stone as one would straighten the dead. "Bring me a rock," she said over her shoulder, "flat, like for a pillar." The young soldier gaped at her and looked around him. and at last picked up a squarish piece of sand rock. She slipped it high under the child's shoulders so that his swollen neck arched upwards, stretched with the weight of his head, which had fallen backwards. "Help me," she repeated to the young soldier. "You'll have to hold his head tight." She looked up at the other, who had stopped a few feet away and now stared at her, wondering but no longer afraid. "You hold his hands and hold his feet down." She looked down at the blue swollen face, smoothed back the dark hair from his forehead, high and full like her own. "He can't fight it much. I think he's past feeling anything," she said. And there was a hopelessness in her voice that made the officer give her a sharp, appraising glance, as if he was thinking she could be crazy. "Wouldn't it be better," he said, "to go quickly to the nearest doctor? He still has a pulse, hasn't he?" She considered, nodding her head a little, like one who understood such things. "I keep a-trying to feel it back there. I couldn't on the mule, but his heart right now, it's not good." She looked at him and said in a low voice, "I've seen young'uns die. He ain't hardly breathing." And then looked down again at the child. "Hold his hands and keep his feet down. There's no use of talking and getting to the doctor. The war got the closest. The next is better than 15 miles down the road. Maybe he's out of his office." "Oh," the officer said, and hesitantly drew closer and stooped above the child. But he made no move to touch him. "Hold him," the woman repeated. "His hands." With a shiver through it, as if she was very cold. Her face looked cold, bluish like the child's, with all the color drained away, leaving the tan, weather-beaten skin of her high cheekbones and jutting nose and chin like a brown freckled mask painted on a cold, frightened face with wide, frightened eyes. She looked again at the child, struggling feebly now with a sharp, hoarse breath, all her eyes and her thoughts for him, so that she seemed alone by the sloping sand rock with the mist below her in the valley and the little fog-darkened pines a wall between her and the road. She touched his forehead, whispering, Amos, I can't let the war get you too." Then her eyes were on his neck, bowed up above the rock pillow, and they stayed there as she repeated, "Hold him tight now." The older man, with the air of one humoring a forlorn and helpless creature, took the child's hands in one of his hands and put the other about his ankles. The young soldier, gripping the child's head, drew a sharp, surprised breath, but the other, staring down at patched overalls' knees, saw nothing until he looked up. There was a long, bright knife drawing swiftly away from the swollen neck, leaving behind it a thin line that for an instant seemed no cut at all and hardly a mark, until the blood started seeping out, thickening the line and distorting it. The woman did not look away from the red line, but was still like a stone woman, not breathing, and her face was frozen. Her lips were bloodless and gripped together. The large drops of sweat on her forehead were unmoving, hanging as she squatted her head and she bent above the child. The officer cried, "You can't do that! You're killing! You can't do that!" He might have been the wind stirring fog in the valley for all she heard. The fingers of her left hand moved quickly over the cut skin, feeling and pulling the skin apart, holding it thumb on one side, finger on the other, shaping a red bowed mouth grinning up from the child's neck. "Please," the man was begging, and he started choking as if he had nausea. The knife moved again, and in the silence there came a little hissing. A red film bubbled up and streaked with pus and grew on the red dripping wound. It rose higher and higher and burst. the child struggled and gave an inhuman whistling cry. The woman wiped the knife blade on her shoe top with one hand, while the other she lifted the child's neck higher, and then swiftly using one hand closed the knife shut, dropped it into her pocket, and drew out a clean folded handkerchief. She gently but quickly wiped the blood and pus from the gaping hole, whispering to the child as it struggled, giving its little hoarse, inhumane cries. "Save your breath, honey. They just got a little old cut, and that ain't nothing for a big boy like you, near 4 years old." She spoke in a low, jerky voice, like one who has run a long way or lifted a heavy weight and has no more breath to speak. She laid down the handkerchief, hunted with her free hand an instant in the back of her hair, and brought out a hairpin. She wiped it on the handkerchief, inserted the bent end in the cut, and then slowly, watching the hole carefully, drew her hand from under the child's neck, all the while holding the hole open with a hairpin. The young soldier, who never loosened his grip on the child's head, drew a long, shivering breath when he looked at admiration at the woman, searching for her eyes but finding them still on the child. He looked toward the officer and at once gave an angry, whispering, "Jesus!" The woman looked around and saw the officer, who had collapsed in a heap, his head on Amos's feet, one hand still clutching the child's hands. "He's chicken-hearted," she said, turning back to the child, saying over her shoulder, "You better stretch him out. Loosen his collar. He's too tight in his clothes anyhow. Go on, I can manage." The young soldier got up, smiling a secret, pleased sort of smile. And the woman, glancing quickly away from the child, gave him an uneasy glance. "Now don't be letting him roll off the bluff edge." No, the other said, as he smiled down at Amos, breathing hoarsely and quickly, but breathing, and his face was a little less blue. The soldier looked past the officer, crumpled on the stone, to the wide valley, and then up and across the rows of hills, breaking at times through sheds and banks of the low-hanging fog, at other places hidden so that the low hills, like mountains, were rising into the clouds. He waved his hand towards the hills. "I bet the hunting there is good." The woman nodded without looking up. "Mighty good now. They ain't hardly any left us a man able to carry a gun or listen to a hound dog." "Well, where is—" the soldier began, and then he stopped, for the officer's head was slowly lifting, and at once it was as if the other hand had never looked at the hills or spoken to her. He straightened his shoulders, pulled down his coat, and watched an instant longer. As the head continued to lift, he stepped closer, and after a moment's hesitation and with a swift glance at Gertie, put his hands under the other's arms, standing in front of him so that the officer was between him and the bluff. The woman gave the two a quick, worried glance. "It's high there. Now you guys watch out." "I'm quite all right," the officer said, shaking the other's hands away. He lifted a greenish, watery-eyed face that seemed no longer a soldier's face at all, only an old man's face. "How's the little one?" he asked, getting slowly to his feet. "Breathing," the woman said. "You've done a thing many doctors would be afraid to do without an operating room or anything," he said. All of his need for haste somehow had now dropped away. The other had handed him his cap, but he stood holding it, looking at the woman, as if there was something he would like to say, but he could not. The woman dabbed at the blood and mucus and pus bubbling through the hole. "If that stuff runs down his windpipe and into his lungs, it'll be bad," she said, as if talking to herself more than to the men. "You can give a sheep pneumonia if when you're drenching it, water gets down into its lungs." She looked about her at the little pine trees.
and at the top of the black gum and poplar rising above the bluff, and then away across the road as if searching for something. Once I saved a cow that was choked, and in her windpipe I put a piece of cane. What is it? He asked, careful not to look at the child. It doesn't seem like plain choking. She rubbed her bent arm on her forehead and back across her stringy hair. I disremember what they call it now. It used to be they called it croup. I thought it was more than just plain croup, bad hard croup like he's had afore, till Aunt Sue Annie come. She told me word come in the mail last night that Mealy Sexton's baby was dead. We thought it had the croup when she come a visiting my mother when she come in from Cincinnati. Her baby and him, they was together. She looked toward the young soldier who stood in respectful silence a few feet behind the other. Could you hold this open and watch him? I'll have to get something to put in it. I'll just take a minute. There's a little poplar right there across the road. He glanced as if he needed permission from the officer, but the other had turned away looking sick again. And after a moment's hesitation, the young one came with a fresh, clean handkerchief of his own and took the hairpin and the woman's place by the child. She hurried across the road to a little poplar, and with one swift stroke, cut a bough about the thickness of her middle finger. She cut again the bough with its yellow leaves, unflecked with red or brown, and it dropped away. Then, working as she walked back across the road, she stripped the gray bark from the short length of limb, glancing between each knife stroke at the child. She had crossed the road when she stopped, knife lifted to look at the red card lettered "Entered" in the back, tacked to a fair-sized pine tree. Most of the print was small, but large enough for men in passing cars to read, were the words: Men, Women, Willow Run, Uncle Sam, Living Quarters. Her knife lifted and came down in one long thrust against the card. It fell and she walked on, the knife working now with swift twisting cuts, forming a hole at one end of the wood. You shouldn't have done that, the older man said, nodding toward the card that she had cut off the pine. They need workers badly, as much as soldiers almost. She nodded, glancing again towards the child. But in our settlement, there ain't no one more to get, she said. Is your husband in the armed forces? He asked. She shook her head. His examining date is still about 3 weeks off. Does he work in a factory? He hauls coal in his own truck when he can get gas, and the miners can get dynamite and caps and stuff to work in the coal. The big mines are more efficient, he said. They need materials worse. The only miners they left us is 2 cripples, and one of them's really old, she said. But a good miner back here in these little mines, I've seen them by the road, would be a waste of manpower working without machinery, he said. She studied the cut in the child's neck and listened, frowning to his short whistling breaths. She nodded to the man's words at last, but grudgingly, as if she had heard the words so many times, but could not or would not understand. And her face was expressionless, watching now the knife in the soft wood, now glancing at the child. It's like the farmers, the officer went on, his voice slightly apologetic as he glanced toward the child, struggling again so that the soldier must lay down the handkerchief and hold his hands, while the strain of holding the hairpin steady in the windpipe was bringing sweat to his forehead. They can't exempt every little one-horse farmer who has a little to sell. A man has to produce a lot of what this country needs. She did not nod, but her lips grew tight, as when she had cut into the child's neck. Her mouth was a pale, straight slit below the long, straight upper lip and the jutting nose. There weren't a farmer in our settlement big enough, she said, and her voice was low and sullen. Have you any relatives in the armed forces? He asked. His voice was somehow critical now. Just cousins and in-laws and such now, she said. Now? Well, since yesterday morning, I had a brother till then, she said. Oh, his voice had changed and filled with a kind of proper sadness. Let us hope that he's only missing. Jesse, that's my man's brother. He's the one that got missing. For my brother, the telegram said, he was killed in action. The knife was still, and she sat a moment staring at the hills, repeating slowly, tonelessly, killed in action. These same leaves were green when they took him, and he planted his corn, and some of it he saw come up. He was a farmer, the man asked. The knife moved in the wood again, and she said, well, one of them little ones. The knife fought the wood with sharp, swift jabs, forming a hole the length of the short piece of the poplar. The man, watching stiffly, uncomfortably, trying not to look at the child or the woman's face, said, you are very skillful with the knife. Well, I've always whittled, she said. What? Oh, handles. Handles? She looked down at the hand that held the poplar wood, the back brown and wrinkled, fingernails black and ragged. And then she looked at her palm, smooth with the look of yellow leather. It was as if the hand were a page engraved with the names, while she was looking now at the poplar wood and repeated, hoe handles, saw handles, axe handles, corn knife handles, broom handles, plow handles, grub and hoe handles, churn dasher handles, hammer handles, all kinds of handles. It takes a heap of handles. Sometimes I make them for the neighbors. He was silent, and his glance was fixed on her hands. Handles, he said at last. That wouldn't be much fun in handles. Her face for an instant softened. As she looked up, something that might have been hatred was gone from her eyes. I've never had much time for whittling foolishness. Oh, a few dolls here and there. Cassie, that's my littlest girl. She's crazy over the dolls I whittle. But when I get all settled, I'm aiming to work up a piece of wild cherry wood I've got. It's big enough for the head and shoulders of a fair-sized man. Her voice got low again, wondering as if she talked to herself, if I can ever get the face right. She glanced at the soldier, struggling to keep the child's hands from clawing at the neck. Hold out a little minute longer. I've about got this hole through. The older man stood so that if he looked straight in front of him, he could see the woman but not the child. What kind of face? He asked. She shook the shavings out of the rapidly deepening hole and began on the other end. I don't know. I thought on Christ, but somehow his face ain't never clear or something. Maybe some other, like Amos. I liked Amos, or Ecclesiastes, or Judas. Judas? And he gave her a sharp, suspicious glance. She looked again at the child and nodded, her eyes on the knife blade as she talked. Not Judas with his mouth all drooly, his hand out for silver, but Judas when he gave the 30 pieces away, I figure. She went on after blowing the shavings out of the hole. There's many a one does meanness for money like Judas, she said. Her eyes were on the poplar as she spoke. But there's not many like him that gives the money away and then feels sorry once they got it. She looked toward the child and met the eyes of the young soldier. There was a head nod in his eyes, but he was silent, for the other was saying, you seem to be quite a student of the Bible. She shook her head. The Bible's about the only thing I've ever read. When I was a growing up, my mother was a sick a heap and my father hurt his leg in the log woods. I had to help him and never got much schooling but what he gave me. And he had you study the Bible? He had me get things by heart the way they used to do in the old days. Poetry and the Constitution and a heap of the Bible. She rose, still whittling, and walked towards the child. She stood above him, working swiftly until the hole in the tiny wooden pipe was to her liking, and then with the same gentle skill with which she had whittled, she put the tube into the child's neck. She then wrapped him swiftly in a blanket and, with no glance at either man, walked quickly to the car. The officer pushed himself into a corner as far from the woman and the child as he could. He sat stiffly, trying not to show his distaste for the big woman cluttering his speckless car, just as he tried not to look at the child or show that the inhuman gurgling cries it gave or the whispering bubbles of its breath nauseated him, like the sight of the wooden tube that beat it up at times with pus and bloody mucus. The woman sensed this, and she tried to make herself as small as possible. She hunched over the child, slightly sideways. The driver stared straight ahead at the road. The woman mostly watched the wooden pipe. The officer looked first at one side of the road and then the other, unable to keep his glance from the child. The road left the high pine ridges and followed the twisting course of a creek down into the valley of the Cumberland. Above them on the shoulder of the ridge lay a steep little clearing, stumpy first-year new ground it looked to be, not half-tended. Even in the rainy twilight, Gertie could see the leafless sprouts encircling the white oak stumps and the smallness of the fodder shocks. A woman's fodder shocks. Held up against the hillside on long front legs like stilts was a little plank house with a tar paper roof. Chickens were going to roost in the crooked dogwood tree near the door, and a white-headed child came around the house, stumbling under the sticks of stovewood firewood that hugged in his arms. While on the high porch steps, two other children, one too small to walk, played with an old spotted hound. Though it lay on the woman's side of the road, both glanced at it. The first house after miles and miles of Cumberland National Forest. Then both saw the service flag with one star, blue, in the one front window by the door. I think that's a real poignant part of this chapter here. That the officer thought what he was doing was so important. He was serving. He was of utmost importance. And here is this family, you can tell the way they're described, they're poverty-ridden. Small children, an old hound, bringing in firewood, dirty looking. The house has tar paper, yet in their window, they're flying the star and the flag that people used to put in their homes in World War II to show they had a family member that was fighting. So what he did and what he was doing may not have been such a sacrifice if you consider what the poor people had sacrificed. "What crops do they raise in this country?" the officer asked, as if he didn't much care but wanted to make some sound above the child's breathing. "Oh, a little of everything." "But what's the main crop?" he insisted. "Young'uns," she said, holding the child's hands that were continually trying to grab at his neck. "Young'uns for the wars and factories." He turned his head sharply away as if he wished to hear no more. But almost at once, his unwilling glance was flicking the child's face where the blueness was thinning, and the eyes, less bulging now, showed their dark coloring through half-open lids. "Your child needs a hospital," he said, looking out the window. "You'd better go with us until we reach one. The closest they'd take him with a disease like this is maybe in Lexington, and that's high near 100 miles away." She wiped a trickle of yellow saliva from one corner of his mouth. "He needs drugs, like they would give him for this right now. He oughtn't to wait." "He needs oxygen," the man said. They were silent again, and once more the sounds of the child's battle to breathe filled the quiet car. "Do you farm?" the officer asked in the same aimless, desperate, sound-making voice. A little. I guess every family back in the hills has a little patch of land and keeps a cow and maybe some sheep. The woman turned and looked at him. Her quiet gray eyes were questioning. She gave a slow head shake. Not everybody has a little piece of land. Well, I suppose you have. She shook her head again with a slowness that might have been weariness. We're renting, she said. On old John Ballew's place. He gets half, we get half. She hesitated and then added slowly in a low voice, as if not quite certain of her words. Now, that is. We're aiming to buy us a place all of our own. Oh, how nice, he said, still making a sound, giving a quick glance at the child. A place for you and your children to live while your husband's in the service. Yes, she said, a warm look coming into her troubled eyes, as when she had spoken of the block of wood. Silas Tipton's went off to Muncie to work in a factory. He wanted his wife and young'uns with him, so he sold his place. It's a good place. An old log house, big and built good like they used to build them in the old days. He sold it to old John Ballew for to get money to move on. Old John don't want the place. His boys all gone. He nodded. So you'll buy it and farm it while your husband's gone? Yes, she said, speaking a little more certainly than before, as if her eyes had made the land her own. My biggest boy, Reuben, he's 12, and her eyes were warm again. He likes farm work, and he's a good hand. You like to farm, he said. He wasn't asking. He was glancing at her wide shoulders and muscle-corded wrist, showing beneath the two short coat sleeves. She nodded. I always farmed. My father had a big farm. I helped him when I was growing up. My brother is... And she stopped. She went on again, but the words were a little thick. Way younger than me. After a little space of level road, they were going down again, and the rainy autumn dark came swiftly down like a setting bird. They were sharp, steep curves where the dripping limestone cliffs above gave back the sound of the car's horn. And below them lay a narrow black plain pricked with lights. A train blew high above them somewhere in the limestone walls. The child started at the strange sound, and the woman whispered, "Nothing's going to hurt you, honey." On the low road in the village of the Cumberland, the lighted windows of homes were squares of brightness behind the shadows of the leafless, dripping trees. Then came sidewalks with more store windows bright above them. The woman looked at the windows filled with many different things, and on them were pasted white or red or blue or yellow sheets of paper that bore pictures of Uncle Sam, of soldiers, of sailors, of airmen, of pretty girl soldiers with neat hair, but all held back words like the red sign on the pine tree. Give, Red Cross, join the wax, give blood, work at Willow Run. The car stopped in a wash of light from a broad window, while high above the road more lights made a brightness on the wet leaf plastered sidewalks that lay on either side of the street. The woman, as if unaccustomed to so much brightness, squinted her eyes and twisted her head about as she drew the blanket even closer around the child. Wait, the officer said. Hatcher, make certain there is a doctor's office close by and that he is in. The woman watched the soldier go across the street and then glanced at the officer who was looking out his window as he rolled it down. A door had opened on the street, and through it came a burst of jukebox music. The woman looked toward the sound. A shadow of girlish interest came into her troubled eyes, and then her glance went swiftly back to the officer's head, not taking her eyes off of him. She lifted the child in one arm and with a quick and furtive movement reached into her coat pocket, her hand going down into the lining, searching. The man turned a little, glancing at her in his quick, impatient way, and her hand at once became still and did not search again until he had turned away. The hand was still again, and the young soldier opened the door, saying, "The doctor is in his office right across the street." The woman hesitated, moving toward the open door, but looking at the officer. Her hand was folded in a fist and coming out slowly from her coat pocket. She flushed, opening the fist, showing a warm, limp bill. I want to pay you for the ride," she said, "but I can't find the right change." The officer looked at the $5 bill. Surprise and disgust filled his reddened face. "I wouldn't think of charging," he said, staring at the bill, so worn, so wrinkled. The 5 was barely legible. "But I aim to pay," she said, touching his hand with the money. He reached quickly for the money, like one suddenly changing his mind. "I can change it," he said, and turning away from her, he drew out his wallet. But it was only after she was out of the car that he put bills folded closely together into her hand, saying, "$1's fair enough, I guess. And then, good luck. Help her across the street, Hatcher." "I can manage," she said, dropping the money into her apron pocket. The young soldier stooped quickly and picked up a small, bright thing that had fell from the fold of the child's blankets. He handed it to her as they walked across the highway. "Keep it for your baby," he said. "Stars like that are kind of scarce." "Oh," she said, that man's star. I didn't mean to tear it off. You better give it back to him. Somebody'll get him for losing it. I've heard they're mighty hard on soldiers if their clothes don't look right." "Not on the likes of him," the other said. They had gone a little distance down the sidewalk when the man pointed to the lighted doorway a few steps back from the street. "There's the doctor," he said. She glanced towards the door. "I ain't never been to a doctor before. Clovis, my husband, he allus took the young'uns the few times it was something Sue Annie couldn't cure." His flat, absent-minded eyes opened wide in astonishment. "Lady, you can't be afraid of nothing. Just walk in."